All right. So in this video, we are going to talk about loading MARC records into VuFind, which is a good first step after you have installed it, as was described in our previous video. Because they are the easiest to load, we are going to work exclusively with MARC records today. And I'm going to assume that you know what a MARC record is, but just the one sentence description is it's a standard interchange format for library records where the data is split up into numeric fields with alphabetic subfields. So MARC records are included with VuFind as part of its test suite. So if you just want to kick the tires, it's really easy to get some records loaded in there. You just switch into your VuFind directory. And at the moment, I'm actually looking at the virtual machine I set up in the previous video, and I'm in the VuFind home directory. If I do an ls of tests data star.mrc, I can see all of the MARC records that are available. So first things first, we need to start up our Solr index, which is where VuFind stores all of its records. We can't put things in the index until the index is running. So I do that with solr.sh start. And then it's going to tell me that Solr is starting up on port 8080, a fact that it's useful to remember for later, since we might want to look at the Solr index once it has records in it. And now that Solr is running, there's just a handy script called import-marc.sh that if we feed it the name of a MARC file, which can be either binary MARC or MARC XML, it will load everything into the index for us. So I'm going to choose journals.mrc, which contains some journal records. And it takes just a couple seconds to load all of the data into the index once it gets going. And there we go. So I'm going to go to my web browser now and just do a blank search in VuFind, which is a good way to get a list of all the records that have been indexed. And I will see that I now have 10 journal records appearing in the search results. So what just happened? It might be useful to take a step back and talk a little bit about what Solr is. Solr is an open source search engine, which essentially takes a set of keys and values and applies some rules to those to make them very easy to search and perform faceted filtering on. And so what we did with our script was map some MARC records into Solr. So I mentioned when I started up Solr that it's useful to make note of the port number that it's running on, and that is because Solr has a web interface that you can actually look at. If you just go to the name of the server where it's running, access the port it's running on, and then go to /Solr, you will you will find a handy administrative interface. Solr arranges its records into a set of cores so that you can store different types of records in different index schemas. And in the case of VuFind, the main records are stored in a core named Biblio. So if we go to Biblio and we go to the querying tool, we can run their default *:* everything search. And we will see that here indeed are the 10 records that were put into the index, and we can see some of the field names and values that got placed there. So all of this data was mapped out of those MARC records that we loaded. So how did the indexing tool know what to do with the contents of the MARC records? The answer is there is a configuration file called marc.properties in VuFind's in VuFind's import directory, which contains all of the rules for mapping MARC fields into Solr fields. So if we edit this file, we can browse through and see some of the mappings that are present. This is using a separate open source tool called SolrMarc, which is special built for mapping MARC records into Solr. And so it contains a domain-specific language for specifying these mappings. The simplest thing that you can possibly do is set a field to a fixed string so that every record you import will just have those particular values. And in VuFind's default, we set everything to a collection of catalog, an institution of my institution, and a building of library A. These are obviously settings that you will want to override, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. So MARC records contain two types of fields. The first 9 fields, 001 through 009, are called control fields, and they simply have numeric field designations without subfields. You can see that by default, VuFind takes the first value found in an 001 field and stores that as the unique identifier for the record. IDs are really important in the Solr index because that's how Solr tells records apart. Every record must have a unique ID, and if you index 2 records with the same ID, the second record you index will replace the first one. So if your MARC records don't have their IDs in the 001 field, this is another detail that you will need to customize. So after those first 9 control fields, all of the other fields in a MARC record are called data fields, and they have alphabetic subfields containing different bits of data. And we store a lot of things from those data fields in the Solr index. So for example, the second line here, we get the Library of Congress card number out of the 010 field, subfield A, and this first designation, again, just stores only the first value in the Solr index. Similarly, here we take the 035A control number, but because we're not specifying only taking the first one, that could potentially store multiple values in the index. Moving down a little bit to how we index languages, this is a little bit more complicated. Taking this part by part, the Solr MARC field specifications can have a colon-separated list of different things to pull out, and it will take all of those values and store them in the index as separate values. So here we are taking characters 35 through 37 of the 008 control field, which is usually a language code, as well as 041A, D, H, and J, all as separate values. And Solr MARC supports what it calls translation maps, which can take one string and map it into another. There's a folder in the translation maps subfolder of import called language map.properties, which translates all of the 3-letter language codes that are found in MARC records into the full English names for those codes. You'll also see in here that there are some custom methods, and when Solr MARC sees the word custom, that means it's looking for a Java function with the name that follows. So there's actually a Java class that ships with VuFind and contains a getFormats method, which contains all the rules for specifying record formats. Looking at that is beyond the scope of this introductory video, but by including custom methods in Java, it is possible to write your own and to extend the ones that ship with VuFind, and that might be a good topic for a future video. Also, you can apply translation maps to the output of custom methods. So there's a format map.properties, which takes the very granular formats that come out of our Java code and translate them into a smaller set of more human readable values that will be displayed in the index. One last example of some of the power and flexibility of Solr MARC is here at the very bottom. So the pattern maps I mentioned before, or rather the translation maps I mentioned before, are separate files. But you can also include translation maps inline in the mark.properties file by giving them a name and wrapping them in parentheses. And the translations don't have to be straight string to string. You can also define a set of regular expression rules to apply. So these last 5 lines of the file are the rules for extracting the numeric portion of OCLC numbers found in 035A. So The rule says take all the values from 035A and apply this pattern map. And then this pattern 0, pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3 stuff is providing a series of regular expressions that will be tested against all the strings that are extracted. And if matches are found, mappings will be made. So this, for example, takes the different case variations of OC, OLC in parentheses, and then extracts just the numeric portion using regular expression subpattern matching to $1. And then this gets the OCM versions, the OCN versions, and the ON versions. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, there are a variety of different ways that OCLC numbers are prefixed depending on the age and source of the records. And for VuFind's purposes, we only care about the numbers, hence all of these mapping rules. So now that I've showed you how VuFind works by default, it would be useful to know how you can change and customize these things. So before I dive completely into that, a quick aside about the VuFind local directory, which is an important concept for not just import, but also configuration more generally of VuFind. So when you set up VuFind, the installer gives you two environment variables. There's VuFind home, which in this instance is user local VuFind, and there's VuFind local dir, which in this instance is user local VuFind local. The reason for this local directory is to give you a place to store all of your local files separately from the files that are distributed as part of VuFind. This offers a couple of advantages. One being that you can have multiple configurations of VuFind at once and switch between them by just changing the variable that tells VuFind where to load its configurations. The other is that when you upgrade VuFind, you only need to keep track of a couple of directories of your local files. The rest you can delete and replace with a new version, which makes the upgrade process a little bit more streamlined. But in general, the way VuFind uses the local directory is that when it's trying to load a configuration of any sort, it will look in the local directory first. If it finds something there, it will use it. If it does not find it there, it will go up to VuFind home. So this is why there are a lot of parallel structures. So for example, there's an import directory inside VuFind home, which contains lots of default configurations. But there's also a local import directory, which contains a smaller number of files, which are all local overrides. And as you can see here, when you first install VuFind, you actually get a couple of files in there for free, import properties and import auth.properties. And these are the files which tell SolarMark where to find its configurations and other dependencies. And so they are auto-generated for you by the installer to point at the directories that VuFind is being installed into. Import.properties is the primary configuration file for loading into the Biblio core, and import auth is for loading authority records, which again may be a topic for a future video. Let's just take a quick look at import.properties so you can see what's in there. It's not a whole lot. We just specify which core name we're loading things into. We're specifying the names of the properties files that we're using for mappings. So as you can see, here is the marc.properties file I showed you, and also a second file called marc local.properties, which is a way that you can create a file that overrides parts of marc.properties without overriding all of it. And we will be working with that in a little bit. Also, we have the URL where Solar is running so that SolarMark can push the records into its update handler. And then solarmark.path, which is the location of the SolarMark files. And as you can see, we specify first the local import directory and then the main import directory, which is how we load local files ahead of default files. Then there are also a few defaults about error handling and character encodings that you should be able to leave alone, but which are here for you to tweak if you ever need to. So with all of that out of the way, let's start customizing some things. So the first thing that we should do is create a marklocal.properties file in our local import directory so we have a local place to begin putting our customizations. So the easiest way to do that is to copy the standard marklocal.properties, which contains a whole lot of commented out examples that might be useful, into local import, and then edit it there. So as I mentioned, by default, VuFind indexes everything to my institution and library A. And so some of the suggestions here in MARC Local are about changing that. So I'm going to call the institution Damien's University, and I'm going to call the building Damien's House, because I have started a university in which I record videos about VuFind. So now, having made that change, I need to reindex all of my records in order for the change to take effect. Whenever you change your import rules, you need to reload your records because the mappings occur at index time. So once again, import mark.sh tests data journals.mark. We wait a few seconds while the records all load. And now if I go back to my web browser and my VuFind search results, you'll see that when I loaded things before, my institution and library A were showing up in these facets. But if I refresh the page, my changes have taken effect. It's now Damien's University and Damien's House. Please don't come to my house. Now going back to the terminal, let's look at another thing we might want to change. So as I mentioned, this is a file full of journals. So if I look at the format facet, I'll see there are 10 journals here. But suppose that I don't like calling them journals. I want to degrade them by calling them magazines. So that is something I can change by editing the format translation map that I mentioned earlier. So once again, we can create a copy of the map in our local directory, and this will override the default map. So first, let me create a directory to hold my custom translation maps, because you're not going to have such a directory by default. So we have to create local import translation maps. And then I can copy import translation maps format.properties, format map.properties into local import translation maps. I've now created a local copy that I can customize. So I will edit that. And as you can see, here is where we map the more technical terms that come out of the custom get format method into more human readable versions. But down here, we just map journal straight back into journal again. But I can change this. Journal equals magazine. And now, if I just go back and import my records one more time, now when I go back to my results and refresh the page, journal has just turned into magazine. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to customize some of these strings, but let's look at some more complicated things. So as I mentioned, languages are currently pulled from a whole bunch of fields and run through a translation map. But let's suppose that I don't want to display those English language names for some reason. Perhaps I would rather set up some settings in my code to change them into something on the fly. What I can do is look at the rule in the core import MARC properties, and I am going to copy this rule. Then I'm going to edit my local import MARC local properties so I can override it. I'm just going to go to the bottom, and I'm going to paste the rule in. I'm actually going to paste it in twice, so I can keep the old version commented out for reference. And then I'm just going to get rid of the language map. So this will just take the codes and index them directly without doing any translation work on them. So now I'm going to import the records one more time. So again, before I refresh the page to show the results, let's see what this looked like before. So here we have English, French, German, Italian. So now I'm going to refresh the page, and sure enough, now we are only getting the raw codes. So one more interesting feature of SolarMark is that you can actually combine together multiple rules. So I realize my example is getting a little bit contrived, but let's suppose that I actually wanted to see both the mapped versions and the raw versions. What I can do is just put both versions of the rule in place, but on the second one, change the equals to a plus equals. And what this will do is it will take all the mapped versions, put them in the language field, and then also take all the raw versions and add those to the language field. This kind of combination can be really useful when you have information in multiple fields of the MARC record formatted in different ways and you want to normalize it in some fashion. You can create a separate rule for each field and then combine all the fields together with plus equals. But for this example, we'll just do it this way. And now I will re-index one more time. And now if I refresh this page one more time and scroll down to language, you'll see that we now have both the 3-letter codes and the mapped names. So that covers the very basic ways that you can import MARC records and customize the way that they're mapped. Of course, there's a lot deeper dive possible here because of looking at the custom Java code, or the whole end-to-end experience of adding a new field to VuFind, not only indexing it, but also making it display in the interface. As I say, these are good topics for the future, but for right now, I'm just trying to introduce all of the basics. If you want to learn more about SolarMark and indexing, be sure to take a look at the SolarMark page in VuFind's wiki, and the SolarMark GitHub project, both of which have some more documentation on how to solve common problems using the importer, and more detail about the depths of the importing language, which is actually quite rich and has quite a few features that can be strung together to do complicated transformations. There's also a SolarMark Tech mailing list, which is a great place to ask for help, in addition to the usual VuFind support venues. So I hope this has been useful, and I will share another video next month.